5:14 a.m. Baghdad time. A Soviet-trained Iraqi pilot pushes his MiG-29 into a climbing spiral over the Tigris River. His radar scope is clean. Ground control tells him 2 American aircraft may be inbound from the west. He banks left, stabilizes at 28,000 feet, scans the horizon, nothing. Silence in the headset. Then a warning tone. It isn't the chirp of radar lock. It's a full shriek missile, incoming. He pulls hard, flares, dives, but he's already dead. 30 miles away, an American pilot in an F-15C breaks left, turns gently back toward the tanker track. His job is done. The AIM-120 he launched 2 minutes ago did exactly what it was built to do, kill, before anyone knew it was there. There was no dogfight, no merge, no visual, just a long-range missile, a clean radar feed from AWACS, and a trigger pull made with zero hesitation across the border. Soviet military advisors monitoring the battle in Iraq slam fists into consoles. This is not how air combat is supposed to happen. They trained these pilots in the doctrine of close-in battle visual ID, radar lock, infrared missile tone, a hard turn, and a contest of skill at 1,000 meters. But the Americans refused. They won't dogfight. They won't merge. They won't show up on radar. They just launch, vanish, and kill at a distance to Soviet command. This is not combat. It's assassination. In the first 24 hours of Desert Storm, 13 Iraqi fighters are destroyed. Not one American aircraft is hit. Not one engagement reaches visual range. And in every Soviet war room, one question explodes. Why won't the Americans fight us? Because to them, this isn't air superiority. It's something worse, air invisibility. And for a doctrine built entirely on seeing, tracking, and reacting, the refusal to fight isn't cowardice. It's the beginning of irrelevance. Deep inside Soviet air academies and command bunkers, air combat had always been taught as an inevitability of proximity. No matter how advanced the radar, no matter how fast the jet, no matter how clever the missile, eventually, you would see the enemy. And when you did, the real fight would begin. This belief shaped everything. Soviet instructors drilled pilots on the merge the moment when 2 aircraft crossed paths at closing speed. Visual contact finally achieved. That was where skill mattered. That was where courage mattered. Tight turns, high G-forces, infrared missiles screaming for lock, cannon fire at knife range. Dogfighting wasn't a phase of combat. It was the point of combat. And so every assumption followed from that belief. First assumption, the enemy would want to fight. Second assumption, the enemy would need to see you to kill you. Third assumption, radar contact preceded every engagement. The Soviets taught that no pilot would fire without confirmation. That firing blind was reckless, wasteful, dangerous. Instructors mocked the idea of long-range missile combat as unreliable fantasy missiles missed. Radars lied, electronics failed. Real pilots, they said, close the distance. This thinking wasn't careless. It was logical, based on decades of experience from Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East. Time and again, air combat had collapsed into close-range chaos. Missiles failed, pilots merged, dogfights decided outcomes. So Soviet doctrine codified it. Ground-controlled intercept guided pilots into position. Formations provided mutual cover. Radar operators told pilots when to turn, when to climb, when to engage. And once visual contact was achieved, the pilot's job was simple fight. What no one in those rooms prepared for was an enemy who refused to play. American pilots in 1991 did not close distance. They did not seek visual confirmation. They did not wait for radar locks. They fired from ranges Soviet manuals didn't even list as combat zones. And to Soviet strategists, this wasn't innovation, it was incomprehensible. Because if the enemy never enters the merge, if he never turns toward you, if he never shows himself at all, then everything you taught your pilots, every drill, every rule, every instinct becomes a liability. The room of wrong assumptions was built on one fatal idea that air combat required mutual participation. Desert Storm proved something far more terrifying. The Americans didn't want to fight. They wanted to end the fight before it existed. And in that realization, Soviet doctrine didn't just crack. It froze. By the late 1980s, Soviet air combat doctrine was a monolith, structured, proven, and deeply hierarchical. It had shaped generations of pilots, from the MiG-15s over Korea to the MiG-23s over Sinai. The pillars were clear radar first, vision second, ground control guided, pilots obeyed. Formations fought together, not apart. Missiles were launched in the merge, never at the edge of range. This doctrine made sense for the tools the Soviets had. The MiG-21 was a bullet with wings unbeatable in a turning fight, but blind at long range. The MiG-23 could shoot at longer distances, but its radar was unreliable and easily jammed. Even the more advanced MiG-29, with its helmet-mounted sight and impressive agility, was still trained for visual range victory. The Soviets invested in missiles. Yes, but they didn't trust them. The R-60 and R-73 were excellent heaters, but they needed visual locks. The longer-range R-27R was guided by semi-active radar, meaning the pilot had to maintain lock until impact. That meant flying straight, staying exposed, becoming predictable. So the doctrine never evolved past the merge. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the Americans were rethinking everything. The Red Flag program in Nevada had turned air combat into a laboratory. U.S. pilots were no longer training for dogfights. They were training to avoid them, to kill from range, to fire without being seen. And by 1991, they were equipped to do it. The AIM-120 AMRAAM had quietly entered service, a true fire-and-forget missile. It didn't need radar lock at launch. It could be guided mid-flight. It could kill targets before they knew they were under attack. But the missile was only part of the shift. The AWACS platform, the E-3 Sentry, allowed U.S. aircraft to see hundreds of miles across the battlefield, with AWACS feeding live target data into cockpits. Pilots no longer needed to use their own radars. They could stay dark, unseen. The U.S. doctrine evolved accordingly. Shoot from distance. Don't wait for locks. Fight individually, not in formation. Trust the network, not the hierarchy. This was anathema to Soviet thinking. Their pilots were taught obedience. American pilots were trained in initiative. So when Desert Storm began and U.S. fighters refused to dogfight, it wasn't a surprise to them. It was the plan. And while Soviet-trained Iraqi pilots climbed, waited, and searched, the Americans had already fired and were already gone. Soviet doctrine wasn't just outdated. It was about to break in half. It happened on the very first night. 2 MiG-29s launched from Al-Taqadum Air Base, west of Baghdad. Their mission intercept inbound coalition aircraft, reportedly heading east. The pilots, both trained under Soviet advisors, followed the script climb, established radar contact, await ground vector. But within 4 minutes, both MiGs were gone. They never locked targets, never received a fire command, never saw who killed them. Post-strike analysis revealed what had happened. An F-15C guided by AWACS had fired an AIM-7 Sparrow from over 30 miles away. One of the MiGs disintegrated mid-air before the pilot could react. The second was hit attempting a blind turn, ejecting too low for survival. Back at Iraqi Air Command, panic set in. Not because of the losses were expected, but because no one saw the engagement happen. The radar logs showed no enemy aircraft within visual range. The pilots made no last-minute calls. There were no missile warnings until it was too late. To the Soviets monitoring in Baghdad, this was impossible. A MiG-29 killed at range by a jet that never appeared on radar, by a missile that didn't need continuous lock, that wasn't a dogfight. It wasn't even combat. It was a strike without opposition. Within 24 hours, it happened again, and again, and again. By the end of the first 72 hours of the war, U.S. aircraft had shot down 18 Iraqi planes. All but 2 of those kills occurred beyond visual range. In multiple cases, the Iraqi pilots never activated their weapon systems. And here was the impossible part. There were no dogfights. None of the engagements descended into the classic high-speed, close-range battles that Soviet doctrine had prepared for. No turning duels, no hard locks, no pilot-to-pilot showdowns, just missiles, launched from distance, killing before the enemy had time to respond. One Soviet advisor wrote in his classified report, "We prepared for contests. What we encountered was execution." Even the most advanced aircraft in Iraq's arsenal, MiG-25s and 29s, were rendered irrelevant. Not because they were weak, but because they were never given the opportunity to do what they were built for. No matter how fast the MiG-25 was, it couldn't outrun a missile it never saw. No matter how tight the MiG-29 turned, it couldn't outmaneuver a threat it never detected. And that was the first impossible event. A war without dogfights. It violated everything Soviet pilots had been taught to expect, everything Soviet engineers had built toward, everything Soviet commanders had ever seen on a scope. And in that moment, they realized they weren't watching evolution, they were watching extinction. The early intelligence reports arriving in Moscow were met with disbelief. Iraq was losing aircraft. That was expected. But the nature of those losses was inexplicable. No dogfights, no mutual radar contact, no American aircraft downed. The Soviet General Staff demanded clarification. Transmissions were rechecked. Black boxes analyzed. AWACS logs were acquired through back channels. What they revealed made no sense. In engagement after engagement, the same pattern repeated. U.S. fighters remained radar silent. AWACS identified targets and relayed coordinates. Missiles were launched at extreme range, sometimes over 40 miles. The Iraqi jets never achieved radar lock. There were no maneuvers, no visual merges, no reactive fire. The word began to circulate within the Kremlin's defense ministry, invisible warfare. But that couldn't be real. Soviet engineers had assured command that the MiG-29 was a match for the F-16, that the MiG-25 could outrun anything in the sky, that their R-27 missiles, under proper command, could counter any U.S. offensive. And yet, none of it mattered. The missile combat models Soviets had long considered unreliable had become the standard, and the Americans had perfected it. To many in Moscow, it was a betrayal of air combat's very nature. This wasn't war. They argued it was a form of electronic assassination. Veteran pilots protested. They had trained their entire careers for the merge. They expected courage, maneuver, instincts. Instead, they saw engagements resolved before their students even knew a fight had begun. Still, some officers clung to disbelief. The Iraqis must have failed to activate ECM. The Americans must be spoofing radar. This is deception. The real attacks are coming, but the facts wouldn't bend. Every kill was confirmed. Every aircraft loss plotted against radar logs. Every Iraqi sortie ended the same way. No lock, no visual, just impact. Eventually, the Soviet advisors in Baghdad stopped sending analysis. They simply transmitted raw flight data and let Moscow interpret for itself. What could they say? That their best-trained pilots were being hunted from beyond the horizon? That the world's most advanced Soviet-designed jets were reduced to prey? That the enemy wasn't flying better, just fighting by different laws, and worst of all, that those laws had already rewritten air combat, and no one in Moscow had noticed? So the disbelief turned inward. Some commanders insisted on jamming reforms. Others quietly began pushing for stealth programs. And a few, mostly younger officers, started whispering the truth. The Americans didn't refuse to dogfight because they were afraid. They refused because they didn't have to. It wasn't cowardice. It was doctrinal checkmate. And by the time Moscow believed it, the war was already over. As American missiles kept finding targets and Iraqi fighters kept vanishing from the sky, the Soviet military establishment scrambled for an explanation, any framework that would make the chaos fit into their long-standing doctrine. The first theory: the Iraqis panicked. It was convenient. It saved face. It implied that the pilots had the right tools, the right training, but failed due to fear or incompetence. Maybe they didn't follow intercept procedures. Maybe they abandoned formation. Maybe they failed to switch on their fire control radar. But data crushed that theory almost immediately. Black box recordings from downed MiG-29s and MiG-23s showed exact procedural compliance. Pilots followed Soviet-trained GCI instructions to the letter. They climbed when told, turned to heading, armed weapon systems, waited for visual contact and then impact. No time to react, no time to fight, no failures, just absence of engagement. If they had panicked, they would have called out, flown erratically, broken formation, but the tapes showed cold, procedural calm right up until the missile tore through the airframe. The second theory: the Americans jammed everything. That was more flattering. It explained why radars saw nothing, why missile warnings came late, why engagements occurred in radio silence. Perhaps the U.S. was deploying powerful electronic warfare tools, spoofing entire sectors of airspace. But even that didn't hold. Some kills occurred under perfect radar conditions. Iraqi AWACS and adapted Il-76 had line of sight. Ground control had unjammed windows. In one case, an Iraqi pilot even got a visual on the F-15 that shot him down, but only after the missile had already been launched. The truth was worse than jamming. The Americans didn't need to interfere with the systems. They simply didn't enter the systems at all. Their aircraft flew without emitting radar signals. Their targeting came from AWACS platforms orbiting hundreds of miles away. Their missiles didn't require radar lock at launch. By the time an Iraqi pilot knew he was in combat, he was dead. There was no system to jam, no lock to break, no contact to intercept. And so, the last fallback theory emerged. This is temporary. Once they run out of AMRAAMs, they'll have to dogfight. But the U.S. never ran out. They never merged. They had designed an entire air campaign to avoid the one domain where Soviet aircraft might have parodied the turn fight. And by doing so, they didn't just kill Iraqi jets. They killed the idea that air combat needed to be mutual. Every kill confirmed it. Every radar tape exposed it. Every ejection sealed it. The wrong theory had lasted decades that a pilot's value was proven in the merge, that courage, instinct, and reflexes decided outcomes. But Desert Storm erased that belief in a week, and as Soviet advisors sat in Iraqi bunkers, listening to silence on the radio after every intercept order, a darker theory took hold. Maybe the Americans aren't changing air combat. Maybe they already changed it and never told us. With the panic spreading through Soviet air defense circles, a new narrative emerged not from data, but from wounded pride. The Americans won because their planes were better, It was a more tolerable failure, one that could be fixed with investment, modernization, and upgrades. If the MiG-29s had failed, it was because the F-15s were simply superior, faster, more maneuverable, better radar, better missiles. But that theory didn't survive the numbers. The MiG-29 Fulcrum was no paper tiger. It was fast, highly maneuverable, and equipped with cutting-edge systems for the time like the helmet-mounted sight and the R-73 Archer missile, capable of off-bore sight targeting. In a turning fight, it was at least on par with the F-16, arguably better. Yet MiG-29s were being shot down before they even entered the fight. And it wasn't just them. MiG-25 Foxbats, among the fastest jets ever built, were also falling. MiG-23s, MiG-21s, and Mirage F-1s met the same fate. This wasn't about aircraft design. It was about how the aircraft were used. Because on paper, many Iraqi jets were close matches to their American counterparts. But their doctrine was a relic, their tactics, Soviet. And that meant they relied on close-range engagements. But the Americans refused to allow that. The F-15s and F-16s of Desert Storm weren't chasing dogfights, they were avoiding them. They didn't hunt for radar locks. They didn't break into visual range. They fired from standoff distances using AWACS data and the newly deployed AIM-120 AMRAAM. And the AMRAAM changed everything. Unlike the Soviet R-27, which required a radar lock throughout flight, the AMRAAM could be fired and forgotten. Mid-course corrections came via data link. Final targeting occurred autonomously. The shooter didn't have to see the target, or track it, or wait. He just fired and turned away, and that single tactical shift turned every Soviet-era engagement plan into a death trap. MiG pilots entered a fight expecting radar dancing, high-speed merges, and brake turns. What they got was a missile from 40 miles out, launched by an aircraft they never saw, tracked by a command plane they couldn't touch. Soviet advisors tried to dismiss it as technological disparity. But it wasn't about machines, it was about doctrine. The Americans weren't winning because their jets were faster. They were winning because they never allowed a fight to happen. Every kill without visual contact. Every missile fired from standoff range. Every enemy plane that vanished from the sky without a trace. That wasn't just tactical success. It was a complete invalidation of the Soviet air combat model. And the second wrong theory, airframe superiority, collapsed the moment anyone looked past the skin of the aircraft and into the system that flew them. Because it wasn't the wings that won, it was the thinking behind them. Inside Soviet intelligence circles, the earliest warnings about a new kind of American air doctrine were faint and ignored. The clues had been their red flag exercises in Nevada, simulating beyond visual range kills, reports of decentralized command structures, cryptic whispers from Warsaw Pact observers during NATO training rotations. But Soviet analysts didn't know how to interpret what they were seeing because they were asking the wrong questions. They tracked platforms, not doctrine. They measured radar ranges, not network integration. They evaluated missile kinematics, not tactical behavior. And as a result, they missed the most important shift in U.S. air power since the end of Vietnam. It wasn't about a new plane. It was about a new brain behind the plane. American pilots weren't just being trained to fly. They were being trained to fight as nodes in a distributed system, a battlefield web of sensors, shooters, and data feeds that rendered the traditional kill chain obsolete. This was not how the Soviets thought war worked. In their model, success came from centralized control. Ground-based radar told the pilot when to climb. Command centers gave intercept vectors. Rules of engagement governed timing, and every pilot was a piece in a top-down machine. But the Americans had flipped the system. AWACS replaced ground control. Pilots were authorized to act autonomously. Missiles didn't need visual confirmation. Data was shared laterally, not vertically. This wasn't just a shift in capability, it was a philosophical coup, and Soviet intelligence missed it. Why? Because they were looking for the wrong kinds of changes. They expected new stealth aircraft, new missile designs, new radar signatures. They did not expect doctrine to evolve, and so they misread the revolution. The introduction of the AIM-120 AMRAAM considered overhyped. AWACS capabilities seen as redundant to ground radar, decentralized pilot authority brushed off as undisciplined. Even after early Gulf War engagements showed U.S. aircraft refusing to dogfight, Soviet analysts assumed it was caution or battlefield confusion. It wasn't. It was intentional. The refusal to dogfight wasn't a retreat. It was the doctrine itself. The kill had moved upstream beyond the pilot's field of view, beyond his radar scope, beyond any concept that Soviet planners had prepared for. By the time the Americans fired their missiles, the outcome was already decided. The Iraqis were flying for their lives. But the Americans weren't flying to fight, they were flying to execute, and Soviet intelligence had failed to detect the most lethal weapon in the American arsenal. Not a stealth jet, not a new missile, but a system of war that refused to wait for a fight. To understand what really shattered Soviet air doctrine in Desert Storm, you have to ignore the headlines about stealth bombers and smart bombs and look instead at the invisible network behind every American jet. It started in the sky with AWACS. The E-3 Sentry wasn't a fighter. It carried no weapons. It never entered contested airspace, and yet it was the most powerful aircraft over Iraq, with a radar range of 250 miles and real-time data link capability. AWACS made every American fighter a weaponized radar node. No Soviet equivalent could match it. AWACS turned every sortie into an ambush. Pilots no longer needed to light up their own radars. They didn't need to reveal position, didn't need to search. They just received a vector, confirmed range, fired, and turned away. But AWACS was just the brain. The hand was the AIM-120 AMRAAM. The AMRAAM changed the very nature of the kill chain. Previous air-to-air missiles required the shooter to maintain lock until impact, a suicidal commitment in many cases. But the AMRAAM was autonomous. Fire and forget. It allowed the pilot to shoot and brake, shoot and climb, shoot and disappear. This wasn't just an upgrade. It was a doctrinal revolution, because now American pilots didn't enter combat. They ended it. They weren't dueling, they were executing. There was no decision tree, just target and fire. Behind that, another layer, red flag, since the 1970s. The U.S. had transformed its air training program into a simulation of modern war. Not just flying skills, but threat replication, electronic warfare, mission planning, and kill assessment. Every pilot entering the Gulf had flown dozens of mock wars before they faced the real one. No Soviet-aligned air force could match that level of live, integrated, multi-domain preparation. And finally, autonomy. Unlike Soviet pilots who waited for orders, depended on ground radar, and flew strict formation doctrine U.S., pilots were empowered to act, to fire without asking, to break off, to use terrain, timing, and tactics without a radio call. It wasn't chaos. It was mission command, an American philosophy of control through intent, not micromanagement. So when Soviet-trained Iraqi pilots climbed into the sky, they were following rules. Hold radar silence until visual contact. Wait for GCI instruction. Enter the merge with a wingman. Meanwhile, their American counterparts had already fired from 40 miles away, guided by a system the Iraqis didn't even know was there. This was the true American system, AWACS as all-seeing eye. AMRAAM as autonomous sword. Red flag as mental preparation. Mission command as doctrinal freedom. It wasn't that the Americans had better pilots. It was that the entire concept of the fight had changed. The Soviets were prepared for contests. The Americans delivered executions. And perhaps the most brutal irony, the Americans didn't want dogfights not because they feared them, but because they had outgrown them. It was supposed to be Iraq's answer to the mounting air losses, a well-coordinated interception. 2 MiG-25s scrambled from Tammuz Air Base, backed by 2 MiG-29s from Al-Taqaddum. They were the pride of the Soviet export fleet, blistering speed, climb rate superiority, and pilots trained by veterans of past regional wars. The target, a coalition strike package reportedly moving northeast, several F-15s and strike aircraft. Likely heading toward Baghdad's southern air defenses, everything was aligned. Ground-controlled intercept calculated vectors. Iraqi radar painted the edge of the incoming formation. The MiGs climbed. Weapons were armed. Pilots steadied their nerves. And then, nothing. In less than 90 seconds, 3 warning tones screamed across cockpits. One MiG-29 pilot turned too late. His jet vanished in a flash mid-turn. The MiG-25s accelerated, hoping to outrun. One made it to Mach 2.2 before disintegrating mid-climb. Not a single U.S. fighter appeared on radar. Not a single dogfight occurred. Only one pilot ejected, and only after his aircraft had already been crippled by a missile he never saw coming. At Iraqi Air Command, Soviet advisors stared in disbelief. The entire formation, trained, timed, supported by ground radar, had been annihilated in 3 minutes. This wasn't combat, it was humiliation. The tapes showed what American pilots later confirmed. The U.S.-8 strike package had been flanked by 2 F-15Cs operating in complete radar silence. Targeting data came from AWACS orbiting 200 miles west. Missiles were launched from 45 miles out. No U.S. jet had to maneuver. No Iraqi aircraft had reached visual contact. Even worse, the U.S. pilots never even knew how coordinated the Iraqi defense had been. They didn't need to. AWACS told them where to fire. The AMRAAMs did the rest in the debrief. One American pilot paraphrased it coldly. They lined up perfectly. We never had to turn. This was the final collapse of illusion. Soviet air defense doctrine built on detection, interception, and close-range engagement had zero answers for what they had just witnessed. No radar solution, no command adaptation, no backup plan, because the very idea of air combat had changed. It wasn't about skill in the merge. It wasn't about tactics in the turn. It wasn't about bravery under fire. It was about who could fire first from beyond the edge of the fight. And that battle, the most coordinated air defense effort of the war, wasn't just a tactical failure. It was a doctrinal collapse caught live on radar, and Moscow knew it. By the end of the air campaign, Soviet military leadership had moved past disbelief. They were now reckoning with something far worse, irrelevance. Desert Storm hadn't just defeated a client state's air force, it had detonated the core assumptions of Soviet air power, and the implications reached far beyond Iraq, because what failed wasn't just aircraft. It wasn't just radar or missile systems. It was the entire strategic concept of how air wars were fought. Soviet doctrine had always been built around balance, force parity, numerical mass, close-range combat where bravery, training, and timing could still decide a fight. But the Americans had revealed a different Model 1, where radar range meant nothing if the enemy never lit his radar. One where pilot reflexes didn't matter because missiles made decisions before pilots even knew they were in danger. One where centralized command was a liability, not a strength. The idea that technology had replaced tactics wasn't just threatening, it was heresy. For decades, the Soviets had prided themselves on pragmatic innovation, simpler jets, mass-producible missiles, battlefield-tested formations. They mocked the West's love of expensive, complex, fragile systems. But now it was clear those fragile systems had replaced the battlefield. And worse, the Americans had done something the Soviets could not integrate every element, surveillance, command, weapons, and pilots into a seamless, lethal doctrine. This wasn't a change in tools. It was a change in time. The Soviets were fighting the last war. The Americans had built for the next one, and no MiG, no missile, no dogfight tactics could overcome that temporal chasm. The ideological wound was deeper than any radar failure. If future wars would be fought from beyond visual range, if stealth, silence, and systems would always outpace raw speed and maneuver, then what was the future of Soviet air power? What did it mean to train pilots for dogfights that would never happen? What did it mean to build interceptors for a world that no longer merged? The Soviet response came slowly. Investment in stealth, experiments in networked air defense, hushed panic in doctrinal circles, but nothing could change the fact the Americans had made dogfights obsolete. And Soviet strategy had no answer, because this wasn't defeat by superior force, it was defeat by irrelevance. And in the war rooms of Moscow, the collapse wasn't just strategic, it was ideological. When the Gulf War ended, Iraqi air bases smoldered, hangars lay in ruins, and dozens of MiGs rusted in the desert sun, charred reminders of a doctrine that had failed before it even fired. But in Moscow, the wreckage was invisible. It was in the silence of command rooms that once preached radar locks and formation flying. It was in the unread manuals that taught tactics no longer relevant. It was in the quiet resignation of instructors who had trained an entire generation for battles that no longer existed. Because the true legacy of Desert Storm wasn't tactical. It was existential. The Americans hadn't just killed enemy fighters. They had killed the very idea of what air combat was supposed to be. And in that death, something terrifying lingered. A ghost, a phantom of irrelevance that haunted every radar console from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok. It whispered that stealth couldn't be seen, that missiles didn't need orders, that data, not dogfights, won wars now. And as new generations of Russian fighters took to the skies Su-30s, Su-35s, upgraded MiGs, the ghost remained, because the question never left. What happens when the enemy refuses to fight the way we train for what happens when he's already fired before we've even seen him? Today. That ghost haunts every doctrine meeting, every procurement decision, every training flight. It isn't the fear of defeat, it's the fear that your entire method of fighting is already obsolete. A war never lost in the air, but in the assumptions before takeoff, and the F-15s that returned to base without a scratch. They didn't just win a war, they wrote a new one.